Welcome back to Wyvern-Hearted Ink and Friends. You can call me Claymore, and today I'm going to be talking about something that I haven't really covered before, and I haven't really done a video like this where I talk about more pulp culture sort of stuff. Pop culture, not pulp culture. But it's really come to my attention, especially as of late. There are some really problematic things happening in the fantasy side of the subculture and like hobby generally. And I think this is like a natural part of things becoming more progressive just in general. Because every time our culture becomes more sensitive to minorities, their struggles, and everything that goes along with that as we progress in society to become more aware of our downfalls as a society and how we should be changing things, there are always going to be people who show growing pains of what of this change, because there are certain people who don't want to move forward in life or are just so stuck in their ways, and they don't realize how bigoted and uncomfortable they make everyone. And it is a real big issue within the fantasy community. And, there's some outliers, some like definitive things that have really been happening, especially as of late within the last like 5 years, that people should be very ashamed of and cause a lot of controversy within our little niche community. I wanted to talk about that today and about how to avoid being problematic in your fantasy work, whether that is a campaign in a D&D group that you want to do, whether that's an art piece, whether that's, writing a book or anything more advanced, writing a movie, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to generally show what is super problematic and what you should absolutely avoid within the community. Give some examples of like what things have been really going wrong as of lately. And then also I wanted to open up this conversation to those of you within the community, especially people of color and people within minorities. Please speak up on this, because we really need to hear from those groups. I know obviously I'm a white person. I'm a stale end of white bread. So I can't say for every minority how things should be handled and that sort of thing, but I just wanted to open up the conversation because I feel like it's kind of the elephant in the room that no one is really addressing, or if they are addressing, it's just aggressively, and it's not talking about how we can prevent these things from happening. It's always just angry and wanting people to immediately, come forward and get rid of things, and just we're not talking through the problem and why it happens. I guess that's what I want to say here, right? Really, there are some people who get it, right? And they're making their stuff more progressive, and they're understanding that like minorities are not going to tolerate this anymore, and that they are not so minor as you think they are. And then there are the neckbeards of the internet, and they don't want anything other than their personal fantasy to be fantasy, right? And it's incredibly disturbing and incredibly saddening. So there are a lot of things that I want to reference for this video to talk about like what not to do. Specifically, there's a lot of things where fantasy races are sometimes, not always, sometimes based on real life minorities. And this can be done well, and this can be done horribly. This can be done super offensively. So we have to be careful. We have to be very careful if you're going to write something with minorities in mind and trying to give them a spot within the lore that like fits what happened to them historically, you cannot get too close to reality, otherwise it's a problem. So specifically for this argument, I am talking about Hadozis. If you haven't seen the controversy on Twitter, where are you? So Hadozis are a new D&D race. They are monkey people, and like the concept seemed really cool at first, right? And then you dig into the lore of the characters, and it's too close. It's too close to a lot of things, and too close to slurring real minorities. They crossed a lot of lines. So people are calling for Hadozis to either be removed or their lore to be changed, or, you know, something needs to be done other than just an apology released by D&D, Wizards of the Coast, that sort of thing. But yeah, so that's the general gist of at least a very specific recent thing that's happened where we really need to improve. Take into consideration any sort of beast race, any sort of race that is seen as lesser, any sort of race in fantasy that is seen as like an evil thing. So, for example, orcs and goblins tend to have very problematic backstories, very problematic lore, and sometimes this can come across as extremely racist. And so there are some things that you should take into consideration. Take into consideration that if you are describing a group of people as being savage, or a tribal, or uncivilized, that these things come across as very insensitive and very bad, and but try your best not to do this unless you are portraying a certain character as having that perspective on a race, but them being very wrong, and them learning about the people and their culture and understanding that sort of thing. Unless you are going to go through like a whole thing like that, please avoid these kinds of pieces of lore. Goblins specifically, avoid talking about thieving people who only care about money and penny pinching and having big noses. There are some other connotations to that that are very anti-Semitic, and you should be careful to avoid those sorts of tropes and things in your lore if you're going to be covering goblins, orcs, hobgoblins, those sorts of things, because while you may not be thinking about those minority people are affected by your actions and the way that you talk about them, because they have been called those things. And it is incredibly insensitive to say, oh, it's fine because that's not how I meant it. Nah, not really. Please understand that this is not meant to be like, oh, I'm so much better than XYZ people because I have never done this. No, I have totally made the mistake of making characters or tropes or things and not realizing how connected it was to real life things and how insensitive and problematic those things were. And I am trying my best to get away from that and to help other people get away from that, because that is not what we want to promote within our niche community. We want our community to be open. We want fantasy to be available to all types of people. Everyone should be able to have a fantasy escape if they want to. And I think that by making changes to be more sensitive, to be more understanding, to open our eyes and perspectives to what other people have experienced, can help us create better fantasy and better entertainment for all people. So I think these are some big things to cover and handle. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover everything. These are just some of the main things that I've seen happen and that I've seen people get upset over, and that I think should be covered as much as possible to help people be better because they should be. We should not all be neckbeards on the internet. It's an absolutely terrible way to go about having any sort of community, is having it just be of neckbeards and incels. We don't want to be those people, right? I just wanted to open dialogue. If you have any things within your minority culture that you would like to say, hey, please don't talk about this, don't use these words, don't use this verbiage, anything like that, please let me know in the comments. Let other people know. Make your own posts and comments about it. I would love to hear more perspectives, because obviously all I have is mine, and from the few people that I have talked to or heard from on the internet that are of minorities, because I am not. And so I just wanted to open that up. The other main thing, right, outside of racial minorities, the LGBT, we've seen a lot of progress on that front in particular, and it's really exciting and it's hopeful, I think. But I do see a lot of backlash for that kind of stuff, both on both fronts of the LGBTQ and on the front of adding more minorities into fantasy. On both fronts, we've seen a lot of backlash from those neckbeard incel people. And it's bothersome. It's upsetting. It's frustrating to know that people can make such judgments against those people and try to make it seem like those people don't exist and that fantasy shouldn't cover them. And it is incredibly frustrating. I'm not really sure how to handle it myself. I like to handle things diplomatically. That's just how I am. That's the way that I want to be always. And honestly, it's hard to be diplomatic with someone who has ringworms. And it is hard to explain to people that they are not the only person on the planet, and their existence is not everyone's existence, and that things should cover all people, especially in places where we talk about fantasy instead of history. Things should be covered in a way that makes everyone feel welcome and invited, right? Because fantasy is supposed to be a fantasy. It's in the name. It should be fantastical. It should be wondrous. It should be outside of this world. For LGBTQ, people like myself who are outside of the binary, we should be seen in fantasy. And we've seen in a lot of areas that's been growing. That's been really exciting, that more and more people outside of the majority are able to be covered in that, but that there is such a backlash against our visibility that people are so offended by us being visible as people, or us being a main character, or that sort of thing. It's so upsetting to hear people complain because they want all their main characters for every story that they read or watch to be straight, cis, white people. It is scary that people feel that way and that people think that that's how life should be, or because that's all they see in their personal lives, or that's all that they expose themselves to, or all they feel comfortable with, whatever it is. That is incredibly terrible, and I don't want to see that become my entire community, because I hate that. And I want to help uplift people of color and people of minorities. If you have any specific examples or anything on either fronts as to things that are upsetting within the community, things that are bothering you, things that you would offer as advice as to not be problematic, please leave them in the comments. I think a lot of this is just remembering to involve minorities, but not get too close to real life lore unless you're doing like a historical fantasy, which, you know, then there's some lines that you have to tread very carefully to create stuff that isn't problematic. But that is possible. It is totally possible. Most fantasy, people that are within a minority should still be seen. They shouldn't be invisible. They shouldn't be talked badly about or have historic things thrown in their face. You know, people are offended by Hidozis or goblins in Harry Potter, or, you know, the house elves. There's so many ways that real life can be mixed into fantasy in a very negative and uncomfortable way, and there are ways we can totally avoid those things. So yeah, that's basically what I wanted to talk about today. And again, I hope I'm not treading on anyone's feet. If you have something you want to say on this subject, please let me know. Make your own video. You know, you can comment it in the comment section. I won't be offended. I will probably pin it if you have good points and you're not just a neckbeard on the internet. So thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys later, and hopefully with more art and less political stuff. But yeah, I'll see you guys later.